2 words, spoken across a crowded room in Oakland, California, 1967. The man who said them was built like a monument, broad shoulders, a jaw cut from stone, hands that had broken concrete blocks on national television. His name was Takeshi Kimura. He was the reigning full-contact karate champion of the Pacific Coast Circuit, undefeated in 11 consecutive bouts, and he was standing 20 feet away from the most dangerous man alive, smiling. Not a polite smile, not an uncertain smile. The kind of smile that says, "I don't believe the legend." The room held its breath, because they knew what Takeshi didn't, or maybe he knew and didn't care. You have to understand what 1967 felt like for Bruce Lee. He was not yet a movie star. Enter the Dragon was still 6 years away. The world hadn't seen him on the big screen yet, not the global world, not the world that would eventually put his face on 1 billion posters. In 1967, Bruce Lee was a name, a whisper that moved through gymnasiums and dojos and late-night conversations between fighters who trained seriously. People said he was fast, impossibly fast. People said he'd fought a Wing Chun practitioner in a private challenge match in San Francisco years earlier and ended it in 3 minutes. People said he could throw a punch faster than the human eye could track. People said he'd studied every fighting system known to man and extracted the marrow out of each one, discarding what was useless, keeping only what was lethal. But people say a lot of things, and Takeshi Kimura had heard every single one of them and had decided they were marketing. He'd said it publicly 2 weeks before that night. At a martial arts demonstration in San Jose, a young journalist had asked Takeshi about Bruce Lee, who was gaining attention on the American martial arts circuit after his role in the Green Hornet had made him a household name in California. Takeshi had paused, rolled his neck, and then said with complete calm, "Bruce Lee is a performer. I respect performers, but let's be honest, he's never fought a real fighter under real conditions. He's overrated." The quote ran in a regional martial arts newsletter, and within 48 hours it had made its way, as all things did in that world, directly to Bruce Lee.
Now, here's what you need to understand about Bruce Lee in moments like this. He didn't rage. He didn't make calls. He didn't post anything, obviously. This was 1967. But he didn't send messages, didn't posture, didn't gather allies. He simply said to the person who told him, "Where will he be on Friday?" The answer was a private training gathering in Oakland, a closed-door event hosted at a traditional karate school on Telegraph Avenue, attended by roughly 40 fighters, instructors, and serious students from across the Bay Area martial arts community. Not a tournament, not a public event, a room full of people who knew, people for whom martial arts was a way of life, not a hobby. The kind of audience that makes the stakes infinitely higher. Because these weren't people who could be impressed by showmanship. These were people who could see. Bruce arrived at 8:47 p.m. He came alone, no entourage, no students, no camera crew. He wore simple, dark trousers and a plain white shirt. Those who were there described him later as looking almost casual, relaxed in a way that seemed almost inappropriate given what was clearly about to happen. Takeshi was already there, working through kata in the center of the room, moving with the kind of deliberate power that made the floorboards resonate. He was demonstrating for a small group of students. He stood 6 feet tall, weighed 210 pounds of functional, competitive-grade muscle, and had the kind of hands, thick knuckles bent from years of makiwara training that left no ambiguity about what he did for a living. The room reconfigured itself when Bruce walked in. Not dramatically, not all at once, but if you watched carefully, you could see it. Conversations stopping, bodies turning, a subtle reorganization of where people stood and how they faced, like iron filings around a magnet. Bruce acknowledged no one in particular. He moved to an open space near the wall, set down the small bag he'd carried, and watched Takeshi finish his kata. Takeshi finished, turned. Their eyes met across the room. "I didn't think you'd actually come," Takeshi said. His voice was even, confident. He wasn't performing for the room. Or if he was doing it so naturally it was impossible to tell. Bruce smiled, genuinely, it seemed. I heard you had something to say about my ability. I said what I said. You're a gifted athlete, you move well, you have screen presence, but I've watched your demonstrations and I've read your interviews, and I think, with respect, that you've built a reputation on philosophy and speed drills, not on fighting, not real fighting. A sound moved through the room. Not quite a gasp, more like a collective sharp intake, because these were people who knew Bruce Lee's history. Some of them had seen what he could do, and watching someone stand in front of him and say this, with this much conviction, this much apparent calm, it was either extraordinary courage or extraordinary ignorance. Or perhaps a man who had been undefeated for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be uncertain. Bruce looked at him for a moment, a long moment, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, it feels loaded. Then he said, "What would change your mind?" There was no formal agreement, no referee, no rules discussed. This was the old way, the way that had existed in martial arts communities long before television or tournaments or weight classes, a demonstration, a challenge, witnessed by the room. They moved to the center of the floor. The gathered fighters arranged themselves in a loose circle, not a ring, not a cage, just a perimeter of bodies that marked the space. The school's head instructor, a veteran judoka named Hiroshi Tanaka, who had trained in Japan in the 1950s, positioned himself near the edge, not as a referee, simply as a witness with enough authority that both men would respect his word if things needed to stop. 41 people in the room. Not one of them moved. Bruce Lee stood in what looked, to the uninitiated, like almost no stance at all. Weight slightly forward, hands open and low, his body language projecting nothing. No aggression, no obvious readiness. He looked, impossibly, like a man waiting for a bus. Takeshi dropped into a deep front stance, traditional, textbook, the kind of stance that had served him through 11 straight victories. His hands came up, closed fists, classic high-low guard. Every muscle in his body became visibly organized. He was coiled, prepared, formidable. The contrast was stark enough that a few people in the room, newer practitioners, people who hadn't seen Bruce before, glanced at each other with something approaching confusion. Was that it? Was that really how he stood? The veterans didn't move. They watched Bruce's eyes. Takeshi feinted left. It was a sophisticated feint, a small shift of weight toward the lead foot combined with a subtle drop of the left shoulder, designed to trigger a reaction, to reveal how a man defended, to gather information. He'd used it to set up a right cross that ended 3 of his 11 victories. Bruce didn't react. Not dismissively, not provocatively. He simply didn't take the bait. His weight distribution didn't change. His hands didn't flinch. His eyes stayed quiet. Takeshi feinted again, this time more committed, a sharper drop, an almost punch that pulled back at the last millimeter. Still nothing. Someone in the watching circle shifted their weight. The floor creaked. In the silence of that room, it sounded like a gunshot. Takeshi reset, adjusted his guard, breathed out through his nose. He was recalibrating. The feints hadn't given him what he needed. He was going to have to take a different approach.
He began to close distance, controlled, measured, weight transfer executed with the precision of a man who had drilled footwork 10,000 times. He was eating up the space between them inch by inch, angling slightly to his right to control Bruce's power side, his back foot dragging in a smooth textbook slide. 12 feet, 10 feet, 8 feet. Bruce stood still. 6 feet. He still hadn't moved. And then, and this is the part that every single person in that room would spend the next decade trying to explain to people who weren't there, Bruce Lee breathed. That's how one of the witnesses described it years later in a private account. Not that he attacked, not that he moved, not that he struck. He breathed, like something released, like a door opened. What happened in the next 2.3 seconds was recorded in the memory of 41 human beings and nowhere else. No footage, no photographs. The school had no recording equipment, and even if it had, no camera technology available in 1967 could have captured what occurred at the speed it occurred. But the 41 people agreed on the essential sequence.
Takeshi's right hand began its committed extension, not a jab, a full cross, the same right hand that had dropped men twice Bruce's size. Technically clean, power-loaded, aimed at the center of Bruce's face. It connected with air. Bruce had moved, laterally, impossibly quickly, a slip to the outside of Takeshi's right shoulder that covered perhaps 18 inches of ground in what witnesses described as less than a blink. Not a jump, not a dramatic dodge, a slip, efficient, economical, like water finding a path. And he was already inside, already at a distance where Takeshi's size meant nothing, where reach meant nothing, where the mechanics of traditional karate, built around distance, around the space between opponents, became momentarily irrelevant. Bruce's left hand made contact with Takeshi's ribcage. Once. It was not a dramatic blow by the standards of what movies would later train audiences to expect. There was no theatrical wind-up, no ki shout, no visible tensing of the arm or shoulder. His elbow traveled perhaps 5 inches. 5 inches! Takeshi made a sound, a sharp, compressed exhalation, and stepped back. Then stepped back again. Then his legs made a decision his mind hadn't quite authorized yet, and he sat down on the floor of the gymnasium with the controlled, careful deliberateness of a man who understood that if he didn't sit down right now, his body was going to make that decision for him anyway. The room did not erupt. That's the part that surprises people when they hear this story. They expect chaos, shouting, disbelief, dramatic reaction. That's what happens in movies. What happened in that room in Oakland on that Friday night in 1967 was silence. The deep, specific kind of silence that doesn't come from confusion. It comes from collective, simultaneous understanding. Every person in that circle had just seen something they'd heard described but never believed entirely. Hiroshi Tanaka, the veteran judoka who had trained in post-war Japan and had seen things most American martial artists would never encounter, stood at the edge of the circle with his hands folded behind his back, and he did not move for a long moment. Then he exhaled, and in the exhale was everything: recognition, respect, and something that might have been awe. Takeshi sat on the floor with his right hand pressed against his left ribs. His face was composed. He was a champion, and champions don't let their faces become confessionals. But his eyes were different than they'd been 60 seconds ago. Something had left them. The certainty, the calculation, the comfortable assumption that he understood what the room contained. He looked up at Bruce Lee. Bruce was standing exactly where he'd been, or close enough that no one could say he'd moved significantly. His breathing was indistinguishable from what it had been before the exchange. His shirt wasn't disheveled. His expression was, and this is what those 41 witnesses kept coming back to, kept trying to describe, not triumphant, not satisfied, barely even present in the moment in the way you'd expect. He looked like a man who had turned off a light. He walked to where Takeshi sat and extended his hand. Takeshi took it. Bruce helped him to his feet. The room began to breathe again, slowly, in pieces, like a dam releasing pressure through hairline cracks before the full flow returns. Someone coughed. Someone else shifted against the wall, the sounds of a room returning to itself. Takeshi stood, touched his ribs again, not dramatically, not for the room, just a quiet, private check. Then he looked at Bruce, and he said, and these words were confirmed by multiple witnesses, "What was that?" Not angry, not defeated in the way people expect defeat to sound, genuinely asking. The honest, stripped question of a man who had just encountered something that didn't fit inside the framework he'd spent his entire life building. Bruce considered the question for a moment, not performing, thinking. Then he said, "That was nothing extra. That was exactly what was needed and nothing more." Nothing extra. Exactly what was needed and nothing more. That sentence left that gymnasium on Telegraph Avenue and traveled, the way sentences do in tight communities, from fighter to fighter, school to school, from the Bay Area to Los Angeles to New York, eventually crossing the Pacific, eventually entering the long oral history of what Bruce Lee was and what he understood about combat. And it was, in many ways, the entire philosophy compressed into 8 words. This is where we stop for now, because what happened in the weeks after that night is where the real story begins. The 41 witnesses scattered back to their gyms and their dojos and their lives. But the thing they'd seen in that room, it traveled with them. And the way it traveled, the way it mutated and grew in the telling, and the way Bruce Lee's response to all of it revealed something essential about who he actually was, that's what we're going to get into when we come back. Because the confrontation on Telegraph Avenue didn't just end a debate about whether Bruce Lee was real, it started something else entirely.
Bruce Lee was describing, with surgical precision, the entire operating philosophy behind what Takeshi had just experienced. Everything in his body, every hour of training, every system he'd studied and pressure tested, every inefficiency he deliberately carved away, had been organized around one central idea, that combat is not about doing more, it's about doing exactly the right thing at the right moment in the right direction with not 1 ounce of force beyond what the moment required. No theater, no announcement, no warning. Just the solution arriving at the speed of the problem. And Takeshi Kimura, standing in that Oakland dojo with his hand pressed against his ribs, this man who had broken concrete and fought 11 opponents and been called a champion, was now in possession of that understanding in a way no amount of reading or watching or theorizing could ever have delivered. He'd received it directly, through his own body. That's the only real way. Here's what people don't know about what happened after that Friday night. Nobody talked, or rather, nobody talked publicly. This is the part of the story that tends to surprise people when they hear it for the first time. Because in the current era, something like this would be filmed on 6 different phones and distributed globally within hours. There would be takes, there would be discourse, someone would make a video essay. In 1967, in a private dojo on Telegraph Avenue in Oakland, with 41 practitioners who came from a world that had its own codes, its own understanding of what was owed to the moments that happened within gym walls, the response was silence. Not the silence of shame or conspiracy, but the silence of respect for both men. What happened in that room was not for sale. But silence, in tight communities, is not the same as absence. The story moved. Slowly at first, the way water moves through stone, not visibly, but persistently, finding every crack. A student who'd been in the room told his instructor in Los Angeles. That instructor mentioned it to a colleague visiting from New York. The colleague brought it back and told 2 people. Within 3 weeks, the essential facts of what had occurred on Telegraph Avenue were circulating across the American martial arts community in that particular whisper network that preceded the internet and was in certain ways more effective, because every person who passed the story on had a reputation to protect. You didn't embellish inside that world. Embellishment was its own kind of dishonor. So what traveled was essentially accurate. And here is what made the story unusual. What gave it legs that pure combat stories don't usually have. It wasn't just that Bruce Lee had won. That part was, to those who knew him, not a surprise. It was how Takeshi Kimura responded afterward. Because Takeshi did not disappear. He did not retreat to his school and quietly rework his curriculum without acknowledgement. He did not pretend the evening hadn't happened. Instead, he did something that very few people in competitive martial arts, then or now, are willing to do. He sent a message to Bruce Lee.
Handwritten, delivered through a mutual contact in the Bay Area martial arts community. And the message, according to those who knew about it, said something to the effect of, "I owe you an accurate appraisal. I was wrong in what I said. I would like to understand what you understand." From a man who had been undefeated for 11 consecutive bouts. From a man who had made a public statement in front of a journalist. from a man who had walked into that room with everything to lose and had lost it, and was now, rather than defending the rubble of his former certainty, choosing instead to start from what was actually true. That takes more than physical courage. Bruce responded. Of course he did. There were 2 conversations over the following month, private, no witnesses, no documentation. What passed between them is not known with certainty, but what is known is that Takeshi Kimura quietly incorporated elements of what he had experienced into his own training system over the subsequent years. Not wholesale, he remained a karate practitioner, and a serious one, but people who trained with him in the late 1960s and early 1970s noticed a shift, a new emphasis on economy of motion, a skepticism toward formalism for its own sake, a willingness to ask the question, is this actually effective, or does it only look effective? He carried what happened in that room into everything that came after it, and that, more than any public acknowledgement, more than any statement to any journalist, was the real measure of what the evening meant. Now, let's talk about what Bruce Lee was actually doing. Because this story isn't really about a fight. A fight is just the visible surface. What this story is about is a system, a way of thinking about combat and about life that Bruce Lee spent his entire adult existence developing, refining, pressure testing against reality, and refusing to let calcify into dogma. He called it Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. But the name almost doesn't matter. What matters is the philosophy underneath the name. Most martial arts systems of that era, and many still today, are built around a set of established techniques. You learn the techniques, you drill them, you perform them at demonstrations, you compete under rules that validate them. The techniques become the art, and the art becomes identity, and identity becomes something you defend whether it's working or not. Bruce Lee looked at this and saw a trap. Not because the techniques were bad, many were extraordinary, but because any fixed system followed without interrogation eventually begins to protect itself rather than serve its practitioner. It starts answering questions with tradition rather than with results. It starts measuring success by internal standards, how well you perform the techniques, rather than external ones, what actually happens when you apply force to a resisting human being. He had watched it happen in school after school. Systems that had been forged in genuine combat originally, but had over decades become more concerned with preserving their form than with questioning it. And the people inside them, sincere people, dedicated people, physically gifted people, were training hard in methods that had developed a gap between what they looked like and what they could do. Takeshi Kimura was not a bad fighter. That's important to say clearly. He was an excellent fighter within a system that had its own internal logic, 11 consecutive victories, real competition, real opponents. The man could fight. But his training had been built on certain assumptions about distance, about timing, about the predictable geometry of engagement, and Bruce Lee had spent years specifically studying how to exist outside those assumptions, not to counter them specifically, but to operate at a level of speed and economy where assumptions themselves became irrelevant. By the time Takeshi's right hand extended toward where Bruce's face had been, Bruce was already somewhere else, already inside, already done. And that's the thing about Jeet Kune Do. The name translates roughly to the fist that intercepts, and the interception Bruce Lee was describing wasn't just physical, it was conceptual. He was intercepting the opponent's intention before it became a committed action, reading the telegraph in the body before the message arrived. That's not reflexes. Reflexes are just speed. That's understanding. One of the people who trained with Bruce Lee during this period, a student who spent several months working with him in the late 1960s, described watching him hit a heavy bag. Not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical intensity that film would later attach to his image, just hitting it, working through combinations. And what this student noticed and spent years trying to articulate in conversations with other practitioners was that the sound was wrong. Not wrong as in incorrect, wrong as in different from what you expected. When other fighters hit a heavy bag, even excellent fighters, powerful fighters, there's a particular sound, a heavy thud of mass meeting mass, a force transferring through impact. It's the sound of weight. When Bruce Lee hit the bag, the sound was shorter, sharper, like a crack rather than a thud, like the sound wasn't coming from the surface of impact, but from somewhere inside the bag. And the bag didn't swing on its chain the way it did with other fighters. It shuddered, a localized, concentrated shudder that traveled into the chain and disappeared, rather than the long pendulum arc of displaced mass. The student described watching this and feeling, for the first time, that he was observing a genuinely different category of force. Not bigger force, not faster force, a different kind, applied with such precision and such compression that it bypassed the surface entirely and delivered itself to the interior. 1 inch of travel, the sound of something happening inside. This is what Takeshi experienced in those 5 inches of elbow travel. Not a blow, a transmission. By 1968, the story of Telegraph Avenue had reached Bruce Lee's students in Los Angeles. He didn't tell it himself. He never told stories about himself that way. Students who asked him directly about specific confrontations or challenges would get, typically, a redirection toward principle rather than narrative. Not evasiveness, Bruce Lee was not an evasive man, but a genuine preference for the lesson over the legend. He would say, the fight is not the point. Understanding what made it possible, that's the point. And what made it possible was something he'd been articulating for years, in interviews and in his notebooks and in conversations with students, in ways that the martial arts world was only beginning to genuinely absorb.